Hi, I didn't exactly know what I was going to do tonight, so I thought I would first of all create some just a quick thanks to everybody who was involved in the book. I think it turned out wonderfully, and I wanted to tell a little story about a file. We're here tonight to celebrate, of course, the appearance of a book, but I thought I would talk instead about the disappearance of books. Because, of course, we live in an era in which books are disappearing at an alarming rate. And we're all fascinated with that, almost like people at a car wreck. We're fascinated with magazines that are closing, with newspapers that are closing, with publishing houses that are going under. And we're also fascinated with the new modes of disseminating knowledge and technology this comes along with. And so, it's paradoxical that we're here today looking for a book to hold in our hands. And one of the contradictions of our age is, of course, we're still super fascinated with books, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to have a book in your hand tonight. And so I thought I would bring this image, which actually comes from an article written by Marshall McLuhan in 1970, in which he discusses exactly the demise of three important magazines: Life magazine, Look magazine, and the Saturday Evening Post. And I couldn't help but notice that it's a printing machine hovering in a cloud. And it's sort of like, how could Marshall McLuhan know that 40 years later we would all be obsessed with clouds, right? And of course, he had a completely different idea of what this was, probably. But there's been a long history to fascination with dematerialization. It goes back to, I think of Alan Zitsky in 1924, who thought that the electro library was going to be the next big thing. You could think of Paul Shearbart. We heard the other night that in his science fiction fantasies in the turn of the century, he imagined a race of aliens who contained their entire knowledge in jewelry which they wore around their necks. But tonight I want to go back even further to the year 1771, in which a book was published, and it was largely forgotten now. At the time it was a forbidden bestseller written by a guy named Louis Sébastien Mercier. He looked like that. And it was a book called The Year 2440. And we're roughly in the middle of the time spectrum. That's about 300 years ago, and he was imagining a time about 300 years in the future. And the premise is relatively simple. It's actually one of the first books that was ever about time travel. A guy falls asleep in Paris in 1771, and wakes up in 2440, and proceeds to examine the city. A lovely fiction in which the future is in fact a way of examining the present. And there's a passage in the story which is about him entering a library, and I thought it would be interesting for us to listen to that. I translated it quickly because it was one of the few chapters that wasn't translated in the book. So it goes like this. It's called The Royal Library. I was suddenly alone, abandoned. It was plain day, and I found myself in the Royal Library. I had to assure myself more than once that this was so. Instead of those 4 rooms of immense length, in which enclosed millions of volumes, I discovered only a small cabinet, where there were several books which did not at all look to me voluminous. Surprised at so great a change, I dared to ask if a disastrous fire hadn't devoured this rich collection. Yes, they replied, it was a fire, but it was our hand which lit it voluntarily. The librarian, who was a veritable man of letters, advanced towards me, and weighing all the reproaches which I had made, told me the following. Convinced by the most precise observations, we discovered that vast libraries were in fact the rendezvous of the greatest extravagances and the maddest of illusions. In your time, to the shame of reason, one wrote, and then one thought. Our authors follow quite an opposite course. We have sacrificed all these authors who buried their thoughts under a prodigious heap of words and passages. Nothing leads the understanding astray more than badly made books. For the first notions are adopted without enough attention, the second become hasty conclusions, and men continue in this way from prejudice to prejudice, and from error to error. What remained for us to do but to re-edify the edifice of human knowledge? All we had to do was brush aside the useless bits which hid from us the true perspective. Our days are short, and so they must not be consumed with puerile philosophies. We struck a blow against the miserable controversies of the schools. With unanimous consent, we gathered together in a vast plain all the books which we had judged either frivolous or useless or dangerous. We formed a pyramid which resembled in height and width an enormous tower. It was truly a new Tower of Babel. Newspapers crowned this bizarre edifice, and it was flanked by bishops' mandaments, parliamentary remonstrances, indictments, and funeral orations. It was composed of 500,000 or 600,000 commentaries, 800,000 volumes of jurisprudence, 50,000 dictionaries, 100,000 poems, 1,016,000 records of voyages, and 1 billion novels. We set fire to this appalling mass as an expiatory sacrifice offered up to the truth, to good sense, and to true taste. The flames devoured in a torrent the stupidities of men, as much of the ancients as of the moderns. The burning was long. A few authors saw themselves burned alive, but their cries could hardly stop us. Yet among the ashes, we found a few sheets from the works of, and here is something brilliant. He just reads the first initials of the author's name, so you have to guess who he's referring to. T, H, and A, which, due to their extreme coldness, would not in the end be consumed by the flames. Yeah.